You're listening to The Other 50%, A Herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. We are continuing our series of talking with experts who work in various aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion across industries and in entertainment specifically. Today I sat down with Dr. Tanisha Thelemaque. Dr. Tanisha Thelemaque is a licensed psychologist with over a decade of experience furthering equity-focused initiatives. Her research interests have focused on the mental health impacts of racial discrimination on Black Americans, with an emphasis on the intersections of trauma and gender. Currently, Dr. Thelemaque owns a Bay Area therapy practice, in addition to holding numerous roles within the psychological community. She works with renowned mental health organizations, including the National Center for PTSD, as a mobile applications tester, content writer, and subject matter expert on the issues of race. She maintains a leadership role within the California Psychological Association as the chair-elect of the Division for Diversity and Social Justice. Additionally, she collaborates with individuals in various organizations as a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. Her focus is on developing psychologically safe, trauma-informed work environments and navigating racial trauma and people of color. She is amazing. We are so lucky to have her on the podcast. Here, have a listen. Welcome, Dr. Tanisha Thelemaque, to The Other 50%. It's so nice to see you.
It's lovely to be here with you and see you. This is really exciting. Just happy to jump into it.
Now, I know you do a lot of work in therapy, in mental health, in trauma, in so many things, but maybe you could tell us in your own words kind of the focus of your work and what you do.
That's a great question, because I do a little bit of everything. I say a jack of all trades, a master of some. So in terms of what I do, my goal overall is just to make more safe and equitable spaces, and for people who are, especially at the margins, to feel empowered to do their best work, which isn't just traditional work. It's their work in life, how they're moving through relationships, and how they're navigating all the things around them. So that involves doing work clinically and in therapy that's focused on like centering values and figuring out where you want to be and getting the skills, knowledge, and awareness of yourself to be able to get through it. And since I have a trauma background, that also involves working through some of those traumas and other things that might be impacting you. And then when I do my consulting and other type of work, it's really focused on education around those things, helping people to connect, and hopefully giving them some empowering tools so they can move forward and impacting their circles. Because I think we can all be leaders and shift and change dynamics, but it has to be a collective process where we're all doing our own individual work and working together. So that's always my goal. And that looks different in each setting based on who the group is, but that's kind of the underlying process.
You are doing the important work of the world. Helping everyone keep it together.
That's the goal. Doesn't always work.
I know you also work with people who work in production. And, it's an industry that really prides itself on grit. People working really hard, people working really long hours. It's really hard. Like, for some reason, it's, even if you're doing the most lighthearted comedic project, there's still an incredible amount of pressure, incredible amount of hours. And then if you're working on really traumatic content or in really difficult circumstances, there's this whole range of what people go through in production. And so I would love it if we could talk a little bit. I know one of your specialties is trauma, and what does that look like across the board? And I know you've worked with people in production. So kind of what does that look like in production for people? The longest question in the world.
But a great question. So when I think of trauma, it's hard to have just one specific definition that works for everybody. There's a clinical definition, meaning it's, reached a certain threshold where you might get a mental health diagnosis, a trauma-related or stress-related diagnosis. And that's usually when it's a life-threatening event, or it's kind of real or threatened kind of violence that occurs, or something that's really, we'll say, can lead to an injury, something pretty extreme. So, and that could include witnessing it, and that could include like learning about something that happened very suddenly. So there's that kind of one end of the spectrum. And then there's another end of the spectrum that can be the daily life stressors that take a toll on our body and our mental health. So stress is normal, natural. Even if we're doing something we love and enjoy, it's going to be stressful. Our body's going to react to it. Our heart rate might go up. We might get a little sweaty. It might be hard to focus. It might even be hard to sleep. We can always think of those exciting nights. before something big where we just really can't relax. We're so restless and
Yeah.
it's so difficult. That's just our body reacting to stress. When we think about trauma, it's just more extreme stressor that has a bigger impact on us. And there can be some after effects of that, as I mentioned, like issues with sleep, issues with concentration. Your memory starts to go out the window a bit because if you're not focusing, you're not going to remember things. And there's always a sense of feeling like it's never enough to you, which I think can be big. So when I think of productions and the work that's being done in entertainment, it's a lot of very long hours, tight schedules, a lot of things happening at once. And you're trying to not only do your job, but you're also trying to process everything that's happening. And there's 50 different pieces or more at times that have to come together for you to get the right scene, the right shot, and to be able to move through the process. So when I'm thinking about trauma and stress and looking at it from a production lens, there can be some situations that might be more trauma inducing. There can be based on our own background and experiences, our childhood experiences. And I should say trauma is, and having, they call them like adverse childhood experiences or events, like having some forms of abuse and neglect and all of that, quite common, unfortunately.
I know a lot of people have gone through that list, as that list has gone through the internet and been like, oh God, I ticked 5 or 6 things. I didn't realize I had childhood trauma, because we're so conditioned to just keep on keeping on, not realizing how these things affect us.
Exactly. In many ways, a lot of us have gone through a lot of things. Most of us have. It's very rare for somebody to say, I have absolutely no bad experiences in life. Nothing that would...
I'm fine.
Yeah, totally fine. Nothing has happened. Life is perfect. So knowing that, stress doesn't discriminate, it's also important to acknowledge stress is not equally distributed across our population. Mm-hmm. So we know that if you are, for example, a woman, you're more likely to have, these adverse events, these traumatic events than your male counterparts. Or if you're part of the LGBTQ plus spectrum, there's going to be certain things that you experience that your heterosexual or cisgender counterparts won't experience. And if you're a person of color, there will be things that you'll be exposed to at higher rates than your white counterparts. So in many ways, when we're thinking about how this shows up on a production where there's a variety of people with their different backgrounds, their life experiences, and that exposure to all of that heightened stress and potential traumas, it really can come to a point where people may be not speaking up for what they need, maybe being more short, more irritable, might be having issues that kind of bubble over and you're like, that seems so small. Why are we having this big deal out of it? But it's,
why are we yelling right now? Why is everyone yelling?
Yes. And I come from a family that yells. I'm fine with yelling, but I grew up in Jersey. It's a thing. We're very loud. But in many ways, knowing that we have all of these things we're bringing into it, that it's not that we exist in a vacuum, it's important to recognize how our mental health, how our traumas, how the other stressors happening in our lives might be compressed when we're in this really tight, potentially stressful, and by potentially absolutely stressful environment on a production, working in entertainment, and knowing that you will have so many people also looking at your work. Like there's additional pressures that happen that compound all of those previous things that are also impacting us every day.
There's like an extra layer of vulnerability also as you're doing creative work and showing the thing that you created, whether you're in costumes or makeup or hair or construction, or there's always someone who will have something to say about the thing you created.
Absolutely. And knowing that, that's going to raise your anxiety potentially. If something goes wrong on the day, like maybe you had a really great plan, you're like, this is how the hair is going to be, here's what the costume, like every detail, and something doesn't work out, something goes wrong, but you still have to go on. Like the show has to go on in many ways.
Pivot.
Yeah, it's constant stress going into it. And we are humans. Mistakes will happen. Issues will come up. We always have to figure out how to rebound from them. But in many ways, if we're not considering the many types of stresses that might come in and doing that continual work to make sure we're taking care of ourselves individually and collectively, it's going to lead to a lot more hardship than would be necessary. Pain is a part of life, but we don't have to suffer.
I love that. Now, Is it true that this will also accumulate over time? Like it may not feel that big of a deal show by show, but then 20 years have gone by and does it build up that way?
Yeah. When we think about things like trauma, it can be very cumulative. If we think about stressors, it can build up over time. I always like to think about, and mind you, I haven't worked out in a while, so we'll acknowledge that. But when you're working out and you're building up a new muscle, you know that that is kind of stress tears might happen. And then you rebuild and you build, but if you're not being mindful of how you engage, how you're rebuilding, like eating more protein and having rest days, you know that that will just turn into a bigger injury and you might break something or tear something that then you might need surgery for. So if we take that example, our mental health is similar, that if we're not doing those constant checks and making sure like, okay, we had a bit of stressor that could be good or bad, like how are we healing from it? How are we taking care of ourselves? It becomes something that is a lot bigger and will require a lot more of our attention to take care of.
Now, let's talk about how you do heal that. Because I think there's a lot of talk in this business about, you need to take care of your body. You need to watch what you're eating. You need to not be at craft service all day long. You really have to make an effort to sleep. But there's not a lot of talk about how are you also caring for your mental health as part of it. So what would you suggest?
Yeah. And I should say, I think all those are great suggestions in terms of making sure you're taking care of your physical health. Yes.
Yeah.
Physical health is really important because it is tied to our mental health. But in many ways, I think if we just focus on the physical, we miss out on a huge part of it. If we're just saying you should eat a certain way, but we're not having conversations of like, everybody has their own version of health. And, what are some things causing you to be engaging in a certain way? We won't really get a good solution. So I'm always thinking about healing in terms of, it's funny because as I give this advice, I'm like, this is going to sound so basic, but doing daily check-ins with yourself. I always like to have ritual. So I think ritual can be so important to re-regulate ourselves, especially in this day and age where you might be doing some things in a hybrid method, where you might be doing some things remotely, some things in person, you're meeting new people all the time. There's a lot of engagement happening. So you want to have a nice ritual starting your day where you might do some meditation. You might just take a few deep breaths. I'm always a fan of, if you want to read, if you want to listen to music, things that allow you to really transition ease into your day, because there's going to be a lot of moving quickly and a lot of stressors going on during. And I know also if you are shooting or filming, those days start very early. This might be like 4 or 5 in the morning where you're like, let me get myself ready. So having any kind of ritual allows you to feel prepared. And then at the end of the day, I always like to have a ritual when I'm transitioning back into other parts of my life. So if you can think about having clothes that you take off, I will say this, my mom always said you need to have like in the house clothes, not of the house clothes. That might be a like Black Caribbean thing. But
also take your shoes off.
Yes.
Number
it's
one.
also less mess and easier to actually clean. But yes, just having that where I'm like, oh, when I wear this outfit, I'm in work mode. When I change into a different pair of clothes, maybe it's my favorite sweatpants, maybe it's like a really loose, flouncy blouse that I'm just like, and this is what I eat dinner in, whatever it is.
We take our bra off.
Yes. Yes. Take your bra off, which is always my favorite part of the end of the day, honestly.
It's a marker.
Yes.
I'm just saying.
Yes. And you just figure out what your ritual is, how it feels to shift out of that space and really give yourself the opportunity to say, I'm in a new environment. Let me not carry some of that stress in. And if you are feeling it coming up, I'm always a fan of writing it out or even setting worry time, especially if you're somebody who's more anxious. What I mean by that is, because I saw your face, you just were like, worry time. But what I mean by that is that
I felt that deeply.
When you actually are trying to go to bed at night and you're just like, oh, but I have to do that. Oh, but there's this. There's so many things to worry about every day. And if you said, I'm not going to worry about this at 9 p.m., I'm going to worry about this at 6 p.m. Like I will find a time and I will schedule it in just like a meeting and I will write out all the things that I'm worried about. And I'll actually say, is this workable? Are there things that I actually do need to handle and need to have them handled tonight? Or are there things that I can schedule out, things to be aware of, people I can talk to, support I can get, because you don't want to do it all on your own. And that can free up your mind when you're trying to rest at night to say, oh, I don't need to worry about this now. I have 6 p.m. tomorrow to worry about this. And if there's something really important, you might jot it down. I always like to say in whatever your notes file is on your phone, or if you have a notebook, a physical notebook near you, to jot down some things. And you're like, this is my worry journal. I'll worry about this later. And you can kind of put things down. But it's really about how do you settle into your body and your space day to day. And if you're at work, you might need to take some deep breaths. Maybe you jot down some of those things that are on your mind that you're worrying about or coming up. But really figuring out how do you put some of those things down so you can pick up the things that are important to you in that moment.
Okay, I'm definitely trying that because I am a person who will, the minute my head hits the pillow, start processing my whole day and obsessing. I'm going to try writing it down and not doing that. I will check back and let you know how that goes.
Please do.
I also want to talk about, in production, there's different genres. There's different, working on a game show is probably very different from a documentary about something really traumatic or a docudrama or something like that. And I know you've done some work with like producers who are working on documentaries or docu-follows. Because there's the one piece is you're dealing with subjects who are in or have gone through trauma that you need to take care of. And also that can be very triggering for you as a producer, experiencing that with them. So you also need to take care of yourself. So how do you advise people to kind of handle both of those pieces in that kind of content?
Yeah, I'll say, and there's a couple of different productions and different people that I've worked with that came to mind, but I found that just having the conversation was really important to acknowledge what was going on, to say like, oh, this can be heavy. And I want to also do this work with care while I'm taking care of myself. That can just go a long way. And figuring out what are those social supports you'll need to have in place to make that a possibility. Because I think if we feel like we have to do it individually, like I'm the producer, I have to just keep going. And once we get done with this, then I'll focus on myself. That might never happen. There will always be another thing that comes up. There's post-production, there's this and that. So I found that having those conversations before filming starts is really important, and figuring out like what do we have in place. If that's an EAP, meaning employee assistance program, where people can have maybe some mental health treatment that they can access if they need it. Having a one-time person they can talk to goes a long way even. As I mentioned, having some of those routines and rituals can be really important. And grounding, as you're going through a lot, to say, what can I do to ground myself? If that's going for a walk, if you're physically able to, if that's kind of settling into it. And then figuring out if you know that there will be certain things that will be particularly triggering for you, to have a little bit more care on those days. Naturally, our body is going to be a little bit more riled up, we'll say. Your blood pressure might be higher. You might be a little bit more on edge. Like our body kind of reacts to it because we're sensing a danger, or we're sensing a kind of threat, whether that be actual or, related to our past experiences. So I'm always a fan of planning ahead. That might be my Cat Moon Virgo ascending, but that might just be me. But I'm always a fan of saying, okay, I know today will be a particularly difficult day. We're going to be listening to a lot of stories. I'm going to be taking a lot in. I want to give people space to have conversations. That can be those times where you want to take a step back and take a little bit more care of yourself. You might say, oh, let me not plan anything else after this. Let me give myself some decompression time and have a good friend or colleague that I trust who would understand my experience that I'm going to call and talk to about it, and just really figure out what it means to have confidence. And I think framing is so important. I think we always think about framing in terms of a shot or, things we're doing, but framing your day, framing your conversations, framing what you're going to do and setting an intention can go a long way. And that includes when you're working with your subjects as well. If you can tell them, I know we're going to get into some difficult things. I know tears might come, emotions might rise. That's okay. Giving yourself and others permission to have those emotions goes such a long way in terms of feeling comfortable easing into it rather than sensing it as more of a threat than it needs to be.
I love that. The part about planning ahead reminded me, I recently heard Tracy Ellis Ross on a podcast talking about, she's fairly introverted. You wouldn't know it seeing her out in the world, but that takes a
Sure.
lot out of her, as it does for introverts. And she knows if she has a big event or a big day, she schedules the next day to have nothing, to have her support system with her so that she can process the day. Because, you're always looking back thinking, oh God, what did I say? What did I wear? How did I look? Blah, blah, blah. And she schedules that time out. So smart,
I love
knowing
that.
what she needs to do to take care of herself. Yeah. And I think that's also particularly powerful when you're dealing with someone to name it. Like, this is going to be hard. And we're in this together. I'm here for you. Let's do the super brave thing and go through it. And then I think there's a piece right at the end, not to be like, cut, okay, lunch, gotta go. Walk away. It feels like there's a moment after that to kind of, I always talk about it like you've opened someone up. You kind of need to close them back up before sending them off in the world, right?
Yes.
And how do you kind of do that?
Absolutely. And this is what I do as a clinician all the time, because people come to me with the big emotions, we'll say, or will uncover things that we weren't expecting to uncover. And the unexpected can feel really difficult to really close up. I'm always a fan of saying, let's just do a couple deep breaths. Because physiologically, when we're in that state, our blood pressure rises. It's harder to take deep breaths, actually, and our blood vessels get a bit more constricted or they shift. So it can be really important to just say, we're going to take 5 seconds and take 3 really deep breaths and just say, how was that? And let's just take a minute to just reflect. And if there's anything you want to shift, change, or any feedback you want to give, I'm open. But just leaving it for people to get back down to their kind of normal, whatever that is for them, can be really helpful. And just acknowledging like this might be challenging for the next day or two. You might need a little bit more support. Let's actually think about that. Like, I love what Tracy Ellis Ross is doing, because that is exactly what I would say to do. That is perfect, which is knowing yourself and doing what you need to take care of yourself and setting aside that time and scheduling it in. I mean, again, love a good schedule. So that really resonates.
Well, and knowing sometimes you're going to have a vulnerability hangover. I think Brene Brown talks about the vulnerability hangover. And as soon as I heard that term, I was like, oh, yes, I've often had a vulnerability hangover, especially podcasting. I know sometimes my guests have a vulnerability hangover and we'll talk the next day, to kind of process through it, because it's, it's intimate and it's a lot sometimes. It's so important to take care of yourself.
Yeah, debriefing is so big.
Let's also talk about racial or identity trauma, being in majority white spaces. Because I think there's a perception amongst well-meaning white people, and that if I'm just very nice, then no one should have a problem and we're all just fine. And, we talked to Dr. Banks recently, who says you can't nice your way out of racism. And also, I think we have this false sense of, well, everybody's comfortable and everybody's acting like they're fine. So as long as we're nice, everybody's fine. I suspect that's not actually the case. So maybe you can talk about what that's really like for people, being the only in the room or being one of few, and based on your identity.
Yeah, I always am reminded of, it's kind of like culture shock. Or I always think of the first time I moved it. So I went to grad school in St. Louis and I grew up in New Jersey. And so coming to the Midwest was very different for me. And I realized like, wow, there's a learning curve here. There's just things that I don't know. And I'm constantly off balance just a little bit.
Like my jokes aren't quite landing.
Yes.
The way I interact with people isn't quite, I get that a lot.
Absolutely. And you've lived in New York, so you know the Jersey, New York kind of energy and vibe.
Yeah.
So even walking into a room and just being more direct and that not being received well, and you're like, I am so confused. I always like to think that when we are the only, we oftentimes will go back to that sense of anxiety that you have as you enter into a room and everything's slightly off and you're not really sure why. It's kind of like knowing that anything you do will also be under a bit of a microscope, because people will be expecting certain things of you and you might live up to those expectations or not, but you're constantly aware that there are expectations. So you can never fully relax. It's like taking a test, but it's a pop quiz every day. There's an exam coming.
You don't know what the test is.
You don't know what it is and you haven't studied. And you're just constantly going with that sense of unease because you're waiting for the other shoe to drop and say, okay, and now we're taking the test. And now we're doing this. So in many ways, when we're the only in a space, it can feel very unsafe because you're not really sure what everybody's intentions are. You're not really sure if it's safe to fully be yourself. And you're not really sure if people will receive you well when you are yourself because of their pre-existing expectations of you. So in many ways, being nice sounds great. It sounds ideal, but your version of niceness might be the same thing that puts somebody else on edge. So it'll be really important to set intentions in a space. Consider that people probably will come in a little bit more on guard, a little bit uneasy, just as you would in any new social setting when you don't really know anybody in the room. If you're introduced, I love my metaphors, so apologies if I give you too many. But
bring it.
I always think it's just like when you go to a party and maybe you have a new partner and you're meeting all their friends, you're going to be really on edge. Like, I want to make a good impression. I don't know who these people are. I don't know all these inside jokes. Everybody has these things. So in that same way, if you approached everyone who might be the only in the space as someone trying to make a good impression while also wanting to be comfortable, be at ease, try to be themselves while also not being too much of themselves, and really relating to it like a new person at a party, you would have a little bit more empathy for that concern. And you really want to, instead of saying, why are we talking about race? Why does this apply? We shouldn't be bringing it in at all. To say, how does it apply? How is it shifting somebody's experience potentially? Are there differences in this space? Why is there only one person of this identity in this space? Like, let's have those conversations and that analysis. And we can still come up and say, I know that you're probably feeling on edge. I know this is probably like a scary new situation, or maybe something you've dealt with many times, but I want to just let you know I'm here, I'm present. I see the dynamics. I'm going to try to be helpful. Feel free to come to me if you need that support. Really figuring out what it means to show up for people. And then also maybe shift those underlying systems and structures and make it so there's only one person of that identity in the room. That'd be great.
Right. That's a really important question. Let's address that. Why have we created the situation? And then what are the things that we can do to change it?
Yeah.
I think this is part of the culture work that we're trying to do on productions, and why we talk so much about it's so important to focus on equity and it's so important to focus on inclusion in order to create an environment where diversity can occur and be successful. And so what are some of the things that people can actually do besides being nice to create a real equitable and inclusive environment?
Well, I think the first thing that I kind of modeled was ask people how they actually feel in that space. A lot of times people know what allows them to feel more comfortable. And if you can make approximations to it, that goes a long way. In all of the trainings we've done, the workshops we've put together, and the feedback I've received from cast, crew, and other folks on a production, most people just say having somebody ask their opinion goes a long way. Somebody knowing their name and not just referring to them as their department goes a really long way. People touching base and asking, do you need more help, mentorship, or support? And especially those who might be more senior or have more leadership or might have just been there for an extra season or two than somebody else, them coming in and purposefully inviting them into a conversation does so much. So if that's somebody's first day saying, hey, I know that you're new. Let me introduce you to so-and-so. Would you be open to me providing you some support? I'm always a fan of consent. I love consent in all things. So asking first, somebody might say, no, I'm good. Or they might say, yes, thank you so much. I've been waiting for someone to come up to me. But you give them the opportunity to open up, to connect, and for you to potentially support them. And that goes so far in terms of people feeling included. And if issues come up, which they will, as you're going through all of this stressful, situations, as we mentioned, trauma, stress, all those things from our background coming forward, it helps if you actually have a personal connection with somebody. If you care about them in some regard, if that's caring about the relationship you have with them, how you want to move forward, you're more likely to actually have a personal conversation. If something comes up, you're more likely to get that feedback if you've messed up. And that goes a long way in making sure that you don't continue to do any unintentional harm. And it makes it so that people know that it's a space where they can show up how they need to, which, there are different norms and standards for every, sector, department, place, but they know they can at least talk about it, have a conversation if something comes in, and that avoids a lot of heartache, headaches, and issues later. Typically, we don't want to deal with something after the fact. It's better to deal with it in the moment or immediately after.
And I think that is one of the big arguments for it. I mean, on the one hand, I always sarcastically say, the good news is the bar is so low that there's plenty of opportunity. If the bar is learn someone's name and say hello, you can do that. And I'm also, as I'm listening to you, I'm also listening with the head of like someone who's very busy in production and, oh, that's time I don't have. And I'm too busy, blah, 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 blah. But I think where we are kind of in generations and in the culture and in the land where people want to talk about these things, it's going to take you so much more time later, as you said, to untangle the mess that got made because you haven't taken the time to set an inclusive environment and set a culture where people could show up, be themselves, be heard, say the things. It's going to be so much harder on the other side and take you so much more time. So if anything, out of self-preservation, take that moment at the beginning to learn someone's name, say hello, welcome, what are your aspirations, how can I help you? And also, do a good job.
Yes. If we use that same metaphor of working out, you just like icing your muscles for a day might save you from having a huge injury and a surgery later. And I'm also reminded,
exactly.
I come from a working class background, we'll say. And I remember anytime I had a slight cough, I'd be like, my dad and my mom would be like, we're going to the doctor. I'm like, why? I'm not that sick. And they were like, who's going to pay for the hospital bill if it is something serious? We don't have money for that, but we have money for a copay.
That's good. That's good.
Take care of it now and we nip it in the bud, and then we won't have like a huge disastrous thing later that we didn't anticipate, but we could have intervened in. So in that same way, catch it when it's a cold before it becomes something much worse. We don't want to have huge bills and other issues and hurt feelings that you can't really recover from or come back from when you could have just taken those 10 seconds to say hello, 10 minutes to learn somebody's goals and motivations, or 10 hours to really devote to seeing everybody as full and authentic people rather than just kind of little cogs or just like pawns in a chess game to be moved around in a specific place to make production happen.
Yeah. And I think people who work in production have been through, seen, witnessed, heard about enough disasters, enough horrific circumstances that it really pays to take that moment and do it.
Yeah.
Can we talk for a minute about microaggressions? I know there's a lot of talk about it now, and people certainly throw the term around all the time. Oh, you're microaggressing me, but also it's real and it adds up and can cause trauma over time. So could you just give a quick overview of what really is a microaggression? What does it look like?
Sure. When I think of microaggressions, we want to think of them as everyday verbal, nonverbal, or environmental slight snubs or insults that communicate hostile or negative messages to people who are targeted. And they can be unintentional or intentional. So when I think about an unintentional slight, I always get the like, wow, you did a good job. Like it's a surprise. That can be a slight that might happen. That could be unintentionally trying to compliment somebody. And when there can be microaggressions for a variety of our identities, there can be gender-based microaggressions, like assuming that, for example, a woman can't carry something that's heavy and maybe making constant comments about it or that surprise around it, questioning if they can even do their job if they're in a position like camera, for example, in the camera department where they
cameras are for boys.
Yes. And so you're just shocked when somebody can do their job well. We can have microaggressions related to our race. And that could be, for me, I used to get this a lot. Since I've been talking about it, I get it a lot less, which I appreciate. Which is people being like, wow, you're so articulate. As if I shouldn't be.
Amazing.
And they're confused. And typically, microaggressions come from like a history that might focus on oppression, marginalization, or just differences among people. So people having the articulate comment, that comes from a history of assuming that Black people specifically are less intelligent. The comment about women, it's assuming that women are less capable. And it's coming from a history of women being physically limited in what they could do and what they were allowed to do. So all of these have a history to it. And you might think, that was just a little thing. Like, that doesn't really matter. That was a throwaway comment. So being overly sensitive. But really, if you get that day in and day out, it takes a toll. And a lot of the researchers who really coined the term and really developed it talk about as death by 1,000 paper cuts, because it's not just one thing that happens. It's that you get another one and another one and another one. It turns to such a bigger wound, and it becomes much harder to heal at that point. Again, we keep talking about these little things that add up and accumulate, those stressors that really take a toll. And if you're already, for example, the only in a space, you don't feel fully comfortable. Let's say you're the only woman that's walked in a certain department. They keep making comments about what you can and can't do. And then over time, you're going to think, well, now I don't belong here. I shouldn't be here, because you're going to constantly get those comments and remarks that really eat away at your feeling of feeling included, also eat away at your psychological safety. So you're not going to feel like you can say what you want to or need to in a moment and have that be taken well, because you know that people are coming in with a lot of stereotypes themselves about how you should be. So it really highlights that there can be a lot of issues. And again, they could be unintentional. You could be a very, again, nice, thoughtful person and engage in a microaggression and get things wrong. I get things wrong every day. But because I'm open to it, I can always shift and change and repair and have a conversation and move forward. And so I always want for people not to get stuck on the mistakes they make, because if they're like, well, I should just give up because I'm going to make a microaggression. It's like, no, we really want to focus on the fact that most people can recover from it, that this is not an end all be all. It's actually just a mistake that happens, and you can recover from your mistakes. And that recovery is so much more important than the mistake itself.
I've found, since knowing you and since having this education about microaggressions, catching myself lots of times doing it, and then being so hard on myself about it and taking the time to apologize. And it feels like, why do I keep making these mistakes when I certainly know better at this point? But there are so many unexamined stereotypes that we are just brought up with and indoctrinated with. It just phrases that come out of your mouth without thought. And I have a very poor filter these days. And I just always, I find that catching them and apologizing like kind of heals the moment for everybody. And I've been afforded more grace than I deserve doing that, but it does feel terrible.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure, to receive them and to give them and the whole thing. But I think it's something that we just all have to keep working through until everybody just knocks it off.
Yeah. And I think about it like stepping on somebody's shoe when you're out in public. Like, if you're not paying attention, you're going to do the thing that you might naturally do, which is walk in a certain direction, step on somebody's toes. You don't go, why are you mad at me stepping on you? Your first reaction.
How dare you?
Yeah. It's like, why are you being like, get over it. Just stepped on your foot. You would instead say, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to do that, but I did it. Do you need anything? Can I help? And they might say, no, it's fine. And they're able to move on. But in that moment, it becomes about not just focusing on your guilt that you might have of having done it, but really focus on, what does it look like to repair this? And that might just be an apology. That might also be an acknowledgement of what happened, because an apology without acknowledgement, I think, can feel very hollow. So
I'm sorry. Sorry you felt that way. Sorry you got offended.
Like, it's your fault.
That's not the example. Yeah.
First saying like,
sorry you're so sensitive.
I totally messed up. That was me. Apologies. This is how I messed up. I will try not to do it again in the future. I might mess up again though. Apologies. I'm working on it.
Wait for it.
We're all works in progress. And if you react to something with like my bad, like I'm working on it and I will try to show up for you. People are usually really thankful, because typically what happens if you bring up a harm is that people get really defensive. And then you're like, now I have to do 5 times more work because now this person's mad at me. They're having this issue. And it takes that focus away from the harm that originally happened, which might have been a comment that was made, just like stepping on somebody's foot. If you constantly focus on all these other things, you don't actually get to resolve the core issue. And then after that, why would you want to talk to somebody who's more defensive? Why would you bring anything up? You know, the trust is lost.
And also, how much more helpful would it be if the rest of us as bystanders could just say, oh, I clocked that. Not cool. Don't say that kind of thing. And I think you can do it in a non-confrontational way. It's like, we don't talk like that here. Not cool.
Yeah. I was working in a hospital where it was more male dominated, but there were a lot of women providers. And I had one, and we'll say non-male, but primarily women providers. And there was one supervisor I really appreciated, because anytime one of the patients said something that was sexist, she'd say, inappropriate. That's inappropriate. And then would move on. And they'd be like, what? She's like, think about it. I'm just going to name that. No more energy spent.
Yeah.
Just letting you know. And then she'd continue. It was like, I will still treat you with respect, but I want for you to know, clocked it, saw it, wasn't working. So you might be in the hallway and somebody says something to me and you just might hear her walking by and say, inappropriate. Move on.
It's like, objection.
Yes. Very quickly throwing that out.
And I also, like, speaking of the built up trauma of it all, like, as you were talking, I was thinking of this instance. I worked in sales for a long time. And often if it was, oh, I'm going to go see so-and-so client this afternoon, the chorus was, take one for the team. Wink, wink. For years, until there was a day when I finally exploded to an entire room. You may not suggest I am going to get that client in a sexual manner. That undermines my meeting. It undermines my competence in my job. Knock it off. How dare you? It took years. And then my response was explosive. It was not my finest moment, but it was also not anyone else's finest moment. But it certainly made the point. I don't know if after that behavior changed, but that's a thing that can happen.
Yeah, I think of it just like a teapot. If you just keep putting heat underneath it and you just leave the water there, like, it's going to come to the point where it starts whistling, and you have to relieve some of that pressure some way. And if somebody else would have stepped in for you and been like, oh, I think that's inappropriate, or like, oh, I think she'll probably get it some other way because she's really great at her job, any comment would have allowed for just a little bit of that pressure to be relieved. And you would have also known that you could trust other people in there to have your back. And what you shared is pretty relatable, because it probably wouldn't have taken years for me. Give me a solid 3 weeks and I probably would have gone off. But in many ways, you might feel like, I can't say anything. You know, I'm curious about your ability to even feel like it was a safe space for you to share your experience after they constantly made those comments.
It took until I felt like I had enough power that I could, without having a lot of consequences for it.
Yeah.
But it took a while. I mean, now I would probably cut it off very quickly. But at that time in my life, it was tough.
And I think that's the key, though. Most people feel like they don't have any power. And in many real ways, you may not have that power because of how things are set up. It's very hierarchical, especially in the entertainment industry. And in other industries, too, they just may not talk about it as much. And so you know that to some extent, you probably won't be allowed to, without severe retaliation, to say as much. And that's been deeply ingrained. So even as we're trying to shift and change it and say, let's talk about it before it turns into that big moment or that explosion, people probably aren't going to feel safe to do that unless there is a cultural shift, which those who are in positions of power and leadership currently can do. They could say, like, come to me. I want to hear it. If something comes up, you'll be retaliated against. Things like that, and proving it if it does happen.
It does feel like it really takes leadership at the top setting the culture, because we can say all kinds of things, deep within the ranks, but it takes one eye roll from someone with power to really undermine all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can we talk about just the concept of doing like a check-in at the beginning of a day? There's a restaurant in Los Angeles called Cafe Gratitude, which is delicious food, but also it's probably the most LA thing that can happen. I think there's also, it started in San Francisco, because the dishes are like, I am humble, I am grateful, I am loving. And then when they bring you your food, they say, you are loving, you are grateful. And so it's very what it is.
Yes.
But they wrote a business book about, like, when their servers would come in to work every day, they had a practice of everybody got a 15-minute or 10-minute one-on-one meeting with their manager. And the purpose of that meeting was to download whatever you brought in with you that day so that it didn't interfere with your performance for the rest of the day. And I know that some people are starting to implement that on productions, like during the safety meeting or during the thing, like something horrific just happened out in the world that we know is affecting people. Let's take a moment, acknowledge that, ask if anyone needs support, gather, before we get on with the rest of the day and do the work.
I love that. I love it so much. Again, it's creating that ritual that I mentioned previously, where you can put things down. And if you can acknowledge what's happening in your world, then you can have permission to say, what can I do with it? Because if I can acknowledge that it's there, then I can say, what do I want? Do I want to keep carrying this forward? Do I want to put it down? Do I want to have a further conversation about it? But you have actual options and tools other than suppression, because suppression doesn't work.
It does not work. It will come out at some point. But I think that also triggers, oh, my boss cares about me as a human.
Yes.
And about my well-being, and acknowledging that I might be carrying something today that's heavy or hard.
Absolutely. I think we mentioned it previously, but I want to highlight, we're all folks with very different amounts of stress that we have, different amounts of trauma that we might carry, different experiences. I know that my experience as a Black immigrant woman moving through the world will be different from your experience. And if you can see me in that, that allows me to actually really connect. I'm always in that moment, I actually thought about one supervisor who I think was one of my best, like a leader and a mentor. And it was an older white guy. I just got lunch with him a few weeks ago to catch up, even though it's been years since we've worked together. And we could not be more different, but he showed care. He asked how I was doing and he meant it. And we would just have moments to say, how are things going with this program that you're trying to put together? How are things going with this specific thing? And I would be like, oh, here was this issue. I didn't know if I should talk about it, but we're here and you asked. And just like his caring and compassionate response to me allowed me to actually do much better work than I think I ever could have. To know that if I messed up, that he would have my back. And it made it so that we actually had such a great relationship that I'm like, oh yeah, that's one of the best mentors to this day. And I have a short list of people that I really keep in contact with, that I really carry forward as true mentors. And those folks are always the ones who saw me for me, like actually asked me how I was, checked in about things, showed up for me in different ways. And it didn't have to be big. It's just taking 1 minute out of their day to show that they cared.
Yeah.
So I know that goes a long way, especially when you're in a stressful situation where like, we don't have time. There's constant urgency. I can't be myself. I can't show up. I have to do this. And somebody says, let's slow down. Let's just take 2 minutes. Let's take 10, 15. It shows that you're really important.
I think it's not as hard as people are afraid that it is. And I think perhaps people are afraid of asking a question that they perceive may get them into a situation then that they don't know how to deal with or care for. Because problem solvers, when faced with a situation they don't know how to solve, I think that can be really challenging.
Yeah.
But you're saying that the asking of the question is the important part.
If you told me, I don't know how to solve that for you, but that sounds tough, I might know somebody else. Let's think about it. Who else can support you? Because I maybe can't. That is shows a level of vulnerability and a level of care that goes a long way, because again, we're just all floundering in our own ways to make it work and try and make it work. So
we're all floundering. There's the tweet.
We're all floundering. And we're just trying to do our best. And if you can say, I'm doing my best may not have it today for you, but let's think about it. I want to be able to be supportive. And even that one supervisor who I mentioned is one that I carry with such high regard. He didn't fix all my problems. He didn't know. There were some things where he was like, I have no idea. I'd bring in like, I experienced this thing about racism and sexism. And he was like, wow, I didn't even realize how much I didn't know. And I appreciate you bringing this in. I don't necessarily have a solution, but if you want to talk about it, I'll be here. If you want to brainstorms, I'll be here. And I was like, no, I just wanted somebody to listen. And that was enough. So it's really important to think like, what is the next smallest thing you can do? And if it's listening, being an empathetic ear, acknowledging that you may not have all the answers so that they know, like, I'm just a person like you, figuring it out, struggling in the world and making it work.
And can we add to that the short list of what not to do, which is, are you sure that was racism? Are you sure they meant that? Are you sure that was sexism?
Yes.
I know that guy. He wouldn't have that.
It goes back to that defensiveness, because it's like, I need to defend my point of view or this person or this idea. And if you just went in and say, wow, that sounds tough, I don't need to agree with what happened. I don't need to say this person is so great, or actually, there's this whole other thing. You could just say that sounds tough. Let's just leave it there. Validate that experience. Like, that was rough. I don't know what to say other than that, or I don't have more to give you. I will be thinking about how I can support you, because that sounds hard.
And I think the impulse to do that, especially amongst white people, here, let me speak for all white people, is the conditioning that we've had, and because of all the media representation, to see white people as particularly nuanced, and everybody's different and everybody has different motivation, whereas the same conditioning is to see Black people as a monolith, see people of color as a monolith, see gay people as a monolith, where you can ascribe motivation to whatever their behavior is, because we're not conditioned to see the nuance between people. And I think that's where the empathy part comes in, and just the conscious application of empathy and seeing people as people.
Yeah. And I should say that doesn't mean we erase the fact that we have different experiences, because that can always swing into the like color of faces. Like, I don't see color. We're all humans. So we want to have
there's a human race. That's it.
I want to say that is trying to nice your way out of racism by not acknowledging.
Right.
And all of this, what we're doing, because what you're highlighting is that acknowledging, that saying like, oh, there might be other reasons. Like, if I come in with a bit of an attitude, don't just assume I'm an angry Black woman. Maybe assume that maybe there was traffic, that I might be having some family stuff going on. Assume all of these other things, or ask what's going on in an open way.
You may have dealt with some BS walking in the door.
Yes. Maybe I'm somebody where I'm like, I'm running late, and then this thing happened, and I will just ruminate. I will just be steaming. And I'm like, I can't believe so-and-so said that. And of course, I'm going to bring that in, and you might see my face and think, oh, she seems so aggressive, which would be a microaggression.
She's prickly.
Yes. Rather than being like, oh, is she having a bad day? Let me check in. Are you okay? Like, what's happening? I just saw your face, and I'm like, yeah, I'm having a moment. And then once I talk about it, I can be done with that moment. But we can show up.
Okay, I know we are running out of time. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? Any little nugget you had saved up for us?
What a delightful question. I love that. I think the only nugget I want to add in, there's no one solution. So I want for people to...
That's a bummer.
Yes. It's one of those like many gifts of living, and one of those like many curses at the same time. It's very much a catch-22. You might do everything right, everything we've said, your version of right, and there might still be issues. The metaphorical crap might still hit the fan, and you're like, I bet I did it. But I listened. But I did exactly what Dr. T said.
I'm doing it right.
Yes. So I would say don't get discouraged. Every situation is different. All of the needs are different. And you can just pivot and adapt. Just as we mentioned, maybe that costume might be off. Maybe that wig is not looking correct. You can still pivot, have a great shoot, and move on. In the same way, when we're doing these interactions, when we're having these conversations, when we're potentially messing up and learning from it and growing, it's all about pivoting and knowing that there will be 50 different ways to get to one solution, which is having an inclusive, thoughtful, empathetic space. So figure out what works for people there. I love consent. I love asking. What would you need? Because, for example, me from Jersey, I'm like, tell me things directly. I don't really care about X, Y, and Z.
Don't make me figure it out.
Yes. If you're like, ooh, she has a look on her face, ask me directly. I will tell you. But leave space for me to be the most Jersey version of myself. I'll be great. And then I can come back. But somebody else might need something slightly different. And rather than seeing that as like a burden, see that as like, ooh, this is one of the fun parts of work, which is let's bring all these things together and still have something wonderful at the end of it. So I want to leave folks with that. It's hard work. It's ongoing work. It's fun work too.
And let's try to create spaces where we allow each other some grace to get there.
Yes. Yes. Lots of grace. As you mentioned, you've received a lot of it. You've gotten what you've needed. I've also received a lot of grace and openness, and I'm so thankful when that happens. And I've also, put in that work so I can get that grace to some extent by naming I'm not going to get it right all the time. So call me into a conversation. Let's connect. And people are so open. People's tendency is to give grace, oftentimes, if you come with a degree of openness to it.
Love it. Dr. Tanisha Thelemaque, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Where can people find you?
Ooh, people can find me on the internet. So I have my website, valuesintersectingaction.com. I also have, I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, Dr. T. Thelemaque, and also drttelemaque@gmail.com. So if people want to send me a quick email, have inquiries, connect with me, you can. I have a unique name, which helps. There's not very many Tanisha Thelemaques out in the world. So feel free to connect in whatever way makes sense for you.
Great. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, A History of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Oliver. Thank you to Dr. Tanisha Thelemaque for sharing her expertise. You should immediately go and follow her on social media. And special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Go check out the Catch a Break podcast, the insider's guide to breaking into and navigating the entertainment industry. Thanks for listening. See you next time.